First of all, I'd like to introduce your Mayor, Brett Benbow, and he's going to say a few words to get us started off. So, thank you.
Good evening, welcome everybody to our beautiful city. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners on whose land we meet, their ancestors and their sharing a country, and the many Aboriginal groups and cultures that work, walk and live in Port Augusta. I would also like to acknowledge ex-Premier Jay Weatherall, previous Mayor Sam Johnson of Port Augusta, all the visiting mayors and councillors to our city, the Climate Council representatives and any Port Augusta Council members that may be here tonight. Port Augusta is proud to be a leader of the introduction of renewables currently and into the future, boasting 3 successful projects under operation or under construction. The world-renowned Sunrot Farms, which now has got a 10-year contract with Coles to commence with. The Reach Solar PV project is on the Bungala lands as stage 2 to the grid, and hopefully we'll find a supply for the power for stage 3. And the Nefex Energy Wind Farm currently at Linky Gap, which now has 3 operating turbines, and another 8 projects either submitted for development or waiting for financial approval. These projects identify the many flexible renewable opportunities that are possible not only for Port Augusta but this region, being a mix of solar PV, wind farm, battery storage and hydro plant opportunities. The community energy event here tonight fits in well with Port Augusta natural renewable energy attributes and also supports what will and can occur into the future, not only for Port Augusta but for the region. I thank the City's Power Partnership and Climate Council for choosing Port Augusta to hold this community energy event and for spending the time to visit our great city and the region to observe firsthand what can be achieved in the renewable energy sector. I'm sure you will enjoy your speakers who are presenting tonight, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mayor. So first off, we're going to kick straight off with a presentation from Jay, and he can talk about, well, whatever Jay wants to talk about in terms of the history of how we got to where we are in Port Augusta and South Australia as a whole, and also the leadership that's needed into the future to continue this journey that we're on. So without further ado, Mr. Jay Weatherall.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor, for the kind welcome. And can I also just thank all of you for turning up and listening tonight, because this is obviously an issue of critical importance, not only for this region, but the state and indeed the nation and of course the world. There can be few more important issues than the security and well-being of our citizens. And that's really what we're talking about here when we're talking about the question of climate change. I mean, this region has experienced this very recently. On the 24th of January this year, we had the hottest day in the history of this state, 49.5 degrees in this place. And indeed, the capital city on the same day had experienced 46.6 degrees. So what we're talking about here is an extraordinary confluence of events which is playing out in real time. And there is a sense of urgency about our need to respond to these existential threats to essentially the livability of our state and indeed our planet. But that sounds frightening, but it also represents an opportunity. If you're able to clearly understand the nature of the threat, you're also able to define what's necessary to be able to respond to that threat. And because this is something that's facing really all of us, the opportunity to be a first mover, to realise and to design the response and then share that with others around the nation, around the world, represents an extraordinary opportunity. And I think that that's something that I really want to talk about here. And it's really the starting off point for South Australia's decision to take serious action on climate change. And it really happened back in 2002 under Mike Rann, the previous Premier but two, who began this pathway of taking action on climate change. He accepted and understood the science that was emerging, and quite clear even at that stage that we needed to take action on climate change. And he set us on this path. We were the first state in the nation to enact climate change legislation, the first state to put in place legislated renewable energy targets, and we started off with 20%. 20% target, and we met that. 33% target, we met that. A 50% target, and as I stand here today, the last data in 2018 had us at 50.5% of the state's energy being generated from renewable resources. When you consider that back in 2002 it was zero, that's an extraordinary progression in just 16 years. And that decision that was taken was one, obviously, to respond to the threats, but it also understood that there were opportunities that would accrue to a jurisdiction that moved first. And we're beginning to see that in the way in which South Australia is playing a leadership role in developing some of these extraordinary technologies. I just want to spend a few moments discussing the sorts of things that we did which promoted, in a sense, this agenda. The first thing we did is we set out an ambitious target, and I've spoken about that. The second thing we did was to back that up by using really every arm of public policy to support it. So legislative support in terms of planning changes to make it more permissive for us to build wind farms and solar farms here in this state. We also took administrative decisions to approve projects which were controversial at the time, but it sent a very clear message to the market that this was a place that would be prepared to back in and support controversial projects in the renewable energy space. And there was I was planning minister at the time, and the Premier asked me to design a planning system that permitted these things to happen. And one project, which was quite a symbolic one, was called the Sellex Hill Wind Farm. It was the first wind farm that was promoted for a place that was close to the metropolitan area, so it was just on the border of the metropolitan area. And it was highly controversial. Of course, the issue at that time was amenity. It was the look, the physical amenity of wind farms was the critical issue. And we made that a major project, and we approved that project. Now, it wasn't built for reasons which are associated with the financing of the project, but what it did is it sent a very clear message to the investor community that this was a state cabinet that would be prepared to stand up to criticism and make controversial decisions in favour of renewable energy. Of course, we already had the fantastic natural resources, the solar resource and the wind resource. And in particular, the west-facing coast, the configuration of the Gulf makes this a particularly good wind resource. And so those natural advantages accrued to us. But we tried to put in place some of the other incentives that would be necessary. And so it involved things like putting in place the grant programs that would support projects, putting in place efficiency schemes, feed-in tariff schemes that would encourage rooftop solar, payroll tax exemptions for employment in the renewable energy sector, stamp duty concessions for people that invested in renewable energy projects and other renewable projects. And we also deployed the procurement capacity of the state to advance things. So our purchasing of energy, government buildings applying the use of these technologies, rooftop solar, and we also established bureaucratic mechanisms that were capable of actually promoting these things. So we created within by the time I became Premier, we created a low carbon economy unit within the Department of Premier and Cabinet to coordinate all of the arms of government to actually make sure that we were providing the greatest level of support that we could. And of course the other thing we did was to engage in national advocacy. So we argued against the watering down by the Abbott government of the renewable energy target, which had the effect of freezing investment in new renewable energy projects for a considerable period. We also got involved in international forums. We became an international co-chair of a thing called the Climate Group, which was a group of regions and states that would combine together, share information about best practice and advance the climate change agenda, to put pressure both on our national governments but also to provide a model, a pattern for people to copy best practice from around the nation. So all of those things led to this extraordinary result where we went from 0 to 50.5% renewable energy. Along the way though, there were critical points of inflection where essentially turning points, forks in the road, where if things had gone differently, there would have been a very different outcome. The first, I suppose, significant decision was the decision made by Mike Rann in the first iteration of the Labor government back in 2002 to actually see taking action on climate change as an opportunity to transform our economy. And we took the view that we could decouple economic growth from growth in carbon emissions. And we also took the view, by being a first mover, we could attract the businesses that make the goods and services which would give us the corner of the market. And we wanted to pursue that because we could see an economy that was in transition. Traditional industries, like our manufacturing industry, were in relative decline, and so we needed to reimagine the economic future of the state. So this was very much part of the decision by the government to try and reconfigure the economy. And we also believed that the technological advances would be eventually mature enough to mean that renewable energy would give South Australia an economic advantage in terms of lower energy prices. For much of our history, we have had the highest energy prices in the nation, largely because under Sir Thomas Playford, he decided for very good reasons to no longer buy coal from New South Wales, which was cheap coal, but instead he wanted to open up the state and develop it by opening up the Lee Creek fields and nationalising the electricity market and burning relatively inefficient brown coal or lignite. And that had the effect of meaning that we had a very expensive form of generation. We also have a vast state with very few people in it and had to take our network out to very far-flung places. So the combination of an expensive distribution system and an expensive generation system that meant that we had very expensive energy. The prospect of renewable energy with its almost zero marginal costs of energy production, provided we could unlock the challenges of storage, meant that we could actually have an energy economic advantage, a comparative advantage. Now, once you get an energy comparative advantage, it changes the whole economics of manufacturing. You become a desirable place to add value to raw materials, which has been one of the great challenges of this country. How do you actually take our raw materials and add value to it, rather than just dig it out of the ground and send it overseas? So this was very much part and parcel of our economic strategy. We took advantage of the brief period when every state had a Labor government back in 2007 to commission a review by Professor Ross Garnaut. The Garnaut review was to look at an economy-wide response to climate change and how we should do that. And his report, which is an incredibly important report, said that the cost of adjustment of climate change would only grow and grow into the future if we didn't act now. It also said that there would be massive advantages to those jurisdictions that move first, and it plotted a pathway for that transition. It said there would be costs of adjustment, but those costs of adjustment would be manageable, and they were dwarfed by the extraordinary costs associated with a warming planet. And even though South Australia or Australia is a relatively small contributor to emissions in a global sense, we nevertheless occupy a very important place in terms of international diplomacy. We are a first world country with extraordinary access to technologies, and we can become a leader. And we're influential. We're a middle level power in international diplomatic terms. So we count, and what we do here counts. And he invited us to take action. And of course, within the next year, we had the election of the Rudd government, and they tried to act on climate change. And that was really another pivotal point. We expected to have a Commonwealth government that would play a leadership role in relation to climate change, and the states would then be able to fit within a formal federal framework. But what really happened at that point was the commencement of what are colloquially called the climate wars, and they're being played out to this very day. In fact, today. It's all over the front pages of the paper. This very same question: how do we put a price on carbon such that we make the relevant adjustment to our economy? And the same old arguments have been trotted out for, 12 long years. But interestingly, throughout the whole of this period, whether the federal government acts or it doesn't act, it doesn't change the demands of citizens. Citizens demand their local government, their state government, and their federal government to take action. And if they can't get their federal government to do it, they'll demand their state government does it. And if they can't get their state government to do it, they'll demand their local government does it. So this is not going away as an issue. And so what actually happened when that push to put in place a federal framework fell over with the advent of Tony Abbott and his incredibly destructive approach to this issue? He tore down Malcolm Turnbull for the first time in 2009, and he tore him down for the second time last year on this very same question. But what happens is, once the federal government exits, the state government steps into the space. So it's been really states that have stepped into this leadership role. And so we did that. We continued to pursue our renewable energy agenda in the absence of Commonwealth leadership. This really, but what was sort of implicit in the Commonwealth's decision to not take action at a national level is there was no national framework for investment. And so some of the really big investment decisions that were necessary after, I think about a dozen coal-fired power stations closed over the last decade, was there needed to be new investment in new generation. Firm generation that was capable of continuing to operate the national electricity market in an affordable, reliable and of course clean fashion. And nobody would do that. Nobody would step up. No self-respecting investor was going to put their money on the line for 30 years in the absence of knowing what the national framework was. So we had a national electricity market that was systematically underinvested in for 10 years. And that really blew up in spectacular fashion with the statewide blackout. Now, the statewide blackout wasn't caused by the increase in renewables and the reduction in coal-fired generation, but it made that issue explode onto the political stage. And everybody then used the statewide blackout to advance their particular political perspective. But what it did really in South Australia is it sharpened this issue up as a political issue. We had the federal government that used the federal parliament to essentially attack South Australia at every turn. So we had the spectre of the Prime Minister of Australia, who was telling everybody that would listen that South Australia was a basket case and they couldn't keep the lights on. Now, when you consider that one of the principal roles of a Premier is to advance, in a sense, the economic interests of the state and warrant it as a good and safe and appropriate investment location. The idea of having the Prime Minister of the nation denigrating your state on the basis that it was essentially an unreliable place to invest because of our commitment to renewable energy, you can imagine how damaging that was. Leaving aside the fact that that same Prime Minister had been here a few months earlier telling us how wonderful we were to have our leadership in renewable energy, it was the damaging effect that it had on our reputation that was critical. And it was a massive point of inflection for us. We were being attacked by coal interests that had basically seen this happening in South Australia and saw this as a political opportunity to ram home their point that essentially renewable energy was a folly, and that coal and gas, and in particular coal, had a long-term future in this country. They took that opportunity and they descended upon South Australia. And you remember that on the 9th of February, the current Prime Minister walked into the Federal Parliament with a lump of coal and said you shouldn't be afraid of it. South Australia was at the epicentre of what was this national struggle over these climate wars that were being played out there. What we chose to do was essentially double down. We said that no, we're going to continue to invest in renewable energy, and we're going to take our own steps to secure South Australia's energy future. And so that involved the investment in our own generation capacity, so something which we hadn't done since the privatisation of ETSA in 1999. We stepped back in and bought our own energy generation. A highly efficient means of being able to run essentially firm generation. Ultimately, a ultra fast start gas generator would pick up the gaps that would occur within a particular day associated with a system that was strongly committed to renewable energy. We also put in place the world's biggest lithium-ion battery, which was to deal with stabilisation issues which were emerging. So those were the steps that we took to secure our energy system. And what we found as a consequence of that is that the community had responded to that decision. So while on the face of it you would imagine a statewide blackout would be a catastrophic blow for a government, what people did do is that they rejected the characterisation of the statewide blackout as being associated with renewable energy, saw it for what it was, and continued to ask us to maintain this commitment. So what this meant for us was really at that point when we were faced with this very significant threat to our government and its direction, we decided to stay the course in relation to renewable energy. What this does, though, is it reminds us that through all of these, if you like, the political wars that occur and things get into a stalemate at a political level, at a national level, there's the sort of demands of citizens, and those demands of citizens don't alter. And that is that they want people to take action at a local level to respond to some basic needs. They want, obviously, to have their energy needs met, but they also want to have a future for their kids and their families. They want renewable energy because they believe that's the technology of the future, and they can see that technologies of the past, which have served us well, fossil fuels have been responsible for much of the world's prosperity up to this point, but they were always going to reach their natural limit. They are by definition non-renewable. There was always going to have to be a point in human history where we were going to have to transition away from fossil fuels. What's now made the transition more urgent is, of course, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So people get the idea of the need to think about the future, and they're making those demands. And I think really powerfully we've been reminded of that by the student protest movement. So students who see a future for themselves that's being robbed from them are actually shaming adults and saying, why are you bickering about something which is completely obvious? The world's scientists are telling you that the action is urgent and we want you to take action now. And it brings us back to the way in which really, not national governments, but communities, businesses, citizens, local governments, state governments can work together. And there are extraordinary opportunities for us to partner at a local level. And Port Augusta really represents, I think, a fantastic example of all of those things happening. Port Augusta and the Repower Community Group has for a long period been campaigning on the demand for a solar thermal plant to replace the coal-fired power station at Port Augusta. They built a community alliance. They advocated to government. They managed to persuade our government to use the power of its procurement to give basically a long-term contract which would underwrite that investment. Persuaded the federal government to also make a commitment, a financial commitment. And critically, persuaded the company to stay the course and be involved in making a bid when they perhaps thought that over an extended period of time that wouldn't be available. Now, for complex reasons, that project is not able to go ahead with the current proponent, but there's absolutely no reason why there cannot be a different proponent proposing solar thermal for this region. Port Augusta is incredibly well suited to this technology, and indeed the government contract that was offered has particular advantages. One of the things that we put on the table when we put our government contract together was the notion that the state government's load, which is largely concentrated in the middle of the day, could be met through solar thermal, and through the storage technology, that solar thermal plant could then supply the peak demand for the rest of the state, which largely hits at around 6 or 7 p.m. in the evening. So it provided a particular model for a solar thermal plant that was incredibly well suited to that technology. So I don't think this community should give up on that technology. I think it has strong prospects, and I think that that's something, as the government goes out to tender, I know there's at least one other solar thermal proponent who'll be advancing a response to that tender process. So I think this community must feel devastated that that project has fallen over, but they shouldn't lose heart because they've done so much work in pursuing it. But it's the recipe of communities and citizens and businesses working together, finding local solutions to what is a global crisis that will allow us to move forward. Now, I'm conscious that... to go? Okay. I'm conscious that we're going to have a panel soon, so I don't want to take up too much time, but I think there's a sense in which the partnerships that can be undertaken, South Australia, I think, is entitled to take some credit for the way in which we have fostered a really positive relationship between state and local governments. When we were showcasing the efforts that we were putting in place in South Australia at the Paris Climate Change Conference, the unique relationship between South Australian governments and local councils in this state was something which was rarely seen in other jurisdictions around the world. There was less commonality and shared objectives. So the idea of local government working closely in partnership with the other levels of government is critical. The truth is that subnational governments control many of the systems that permit us to take action on climate change. Our energy systems, our transport systems, our waste systems, our planning systems and the way urban development is formed, all of these things can be heavily influenced by state and local government working together. And increasingly, we're beginning to see answers to a range of these challenges as being distributed energy systems that can be associated with communities which may be isolated, and not and where connections to very long transmission lines might be prohibitive. So local solutions to this global crisis have become more important than ever before. And I think that there is a very strong pattern that we're entitled to assert as a national leadership role. One of the groups I mentioned earlier is the climate group. It's the collaboration of regions and cities. The climate group collaborates with another organisation called the Under 2 Degrees MOU. It's a group of cities that have got together to say that they commit to taking action on climate change such that global temperatures won't increase by more than 2 degrees. Those two organisations have worked together and produced a handbook which has all of the best practice that they've observed around the world. It's been recently published and really represents a fantastic how-to guide for communities and local government to assist them to take action on climate change. And I certainly would recommend you consider it. The Climate Council will obviously make the link available to you. But I think that we've got to get the balance right in this debate between paralysing people with fear and also exciting them about the possibilities of the future. It is scary when you think too much about the fact that sea levels are rising and global temperatures are rising. But we do have the capacity within our own hands, our own intelligence, the cleverness of our scientists, our engineers, our technicians, and there are so many interesting young companies that are coming up with great solutions to these challenges. Now, some have criticised us for pushing too deeply and too quickly into this area. But how don't you, in the face of the size of the crisis? And I have confidence in the ingenuity of South Australians, of Australians, to be able to solve these challenges. Just in the last week, I've come across two new businesses in this space. A young start-up company of sound engineers from the University of Adelaide have worked out a way of listening to wind turbines that can diagnose whether there's a fault in one of the blades, removes the need for a visual inspection. So as soon as they can hear, because there's lots of lightning strikes which just create small damage to the blades, which worsen and then creates quite an expensive job to replace the blades. They can diagnose that immediately by simply listening to the pattern of sound that's produced through the wind farm. I met another company just this week that's working out the challenges of integrating all these different sources of energy that are being put into the grid. So rooftop solar, PV, wind farms, all of these different sources of energy aren't of necessarily the same quality, and they're not as controllable as perhaps the old thermal generators that, while they were dirty, they would chug along and it would be very predictable what they would do to the grid. We need much smarter technology that's able to listen and control and speak to all of the various people that are sticking energy into this grid. There's a company that thinks they've sorted that solution and can provide a solution for the whole of the national electricity grid. They're already selling their solutions into each of the states, but believe that a mega solution for the whole of the nation is something that they'd like to advance. These are the intelligent contributions that are being made by South Australians and indeed by Australians in this sector. And one of the things that I think we decided to do as a state was to project, not only see this as an opportunity, but also see this as an opportunity to project the values and the behaviours consistent with those behaviours of this state. We wanted to project ourselves as a state that was prepared to face up to one of the great challenges of the world, climate change. We wanted to project our state as being clean and green. We wanted to project our state as being one that actually was prepared to take action and use the ingenuity of our citizens to solve big problems. That's what we want to be known as. Not as a state that clings to the industries of the past in the face of all of the evidence to suggest that they're going to disappear. Now, having said that, there's also a critically important element to this debate, which is to make sure that those people that are adversely affected by these changes are brought with us on the journey. So that the trade union movement has coined a phrase for this. It's called just transitions. In other words, those people affected by this change, by the decarbonisation of the economy, should also be offered a helping hand to ensure that they can find the jobs of the future in these sectors, or if not in these sectors, in other sectors of the economy. And that's something that we have to commit ourselves to. And if we don't, it's the right thing to do, it's the proper thing to do, the moral thing to do. But if we don't do it, we will also find that we get resistance to the changes that we're seeking to make in relation to this area. And I actually think that not only does this offer the opportunity of a vision for the state, which is incredibly powerful and attractive, it also offers us something else, and that is an opportunity to renew our democracy. People are sick at heart about the state of politics. They've lost trust in politics and politicians because they don't believe that politicians grapple with big issues. They don't believe that they take hard decisions to resolve difficult questions. And this cannot be, that there is no more important or difficult question than transitioning your economy in this way to a low carbon economy. And I think that the opportunity for citizens to become involved, and I think once again I return back to the Repower Port Augusta movement, that was an act of democracy. It was an act of citizens exercising their own authority, finding their voice, advocating on behalf of their own community, advocating for intelligent solutions and being part of a wonderful answer. So this is the future. I think it's positive, and this community should be proud of the fact that people are here today looking at your community and the leadership role that it's playing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. So as I mentioned, or for anybody who came a bit later, we will be having questions at the end. So I hope you're thinking about what you'd like to know. I'd like to welcome up the Climate Council CEO, Amanda Mackenzie, who will be giving us a brief talk as well. And then shortly after that, we'll move into the panel. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you for coming along tonight, and for those who've been on the Climate Council trip, thank you for being with us. As Tracy said, I'm Amanda Mackenzie, and my role is as the CEO of the Climate Council. To give you a bit of background on the Climate Council, we've been an organisation around for about 5.5 years. Our previous iteration was as the Climate Commission. That was a government body set up in 2011, and its remit was to provide accurate information on climate change to the general public. So there was a whole range of experts on that group who went out to communities all around Australia giving information on climate change. Unfortunately, the first act of the Abbott government was to abolish the Climate Commission, but the people that were working on the Climate Commission, which includes Leslie Hughes, who's on the panel with us today, we got together and thought, well, if this happens, we think there'd be something really lost in the Australian debate. Think that information is the currency of democracy. Evidence-based discussion is really important to a conversation like climate change, so we should still exist. So once we were abolished, a few days later, over a few pretty frazzled days, we created a basic website, we created a media strategy, and we went out on a limb and said to the Australian public, will you support us in creating a not-for-profit organisation? So the website went up at 12 o'clock on the Tuesday. At 12:01, we got our first donation from Jeff in Perth for $15. So I thought, this is a good start. A Twitter conversation went on through the night. So by 6 a.m. when I woke up and clicked refresh on my computer, we'd been raising money at $1,000 an hour through that conversation. It then hit the newspapers, and through the morning we were on radio, and we did our first press conference at about 9:30. where the various different cameras were there watching us. I rushed back to the hotel afterwards to click refresh on my computer again. We'd raised $128,000. I did a little dance in my hotel room, almost fell over with shock and thought, this is going to be a really big day. The rest of the day was a total whirlwind. We had international media coverage on what we were doing. We had Twitter shut us down twice because they thought we must be buying followers, we'd grown so fast. We amassed in that week 60,000 Facebook friends. And then by the end of that day at 11 o'clock at night, PayPal shut us down because we'd raised $500,000 and they thought you must be money laundering. So $500,000 in one day was a pretty impressive feat. But by the end of 10 days, we'd raised $1.3 million from Australians donating on average about $30. And I think the resounding chorus we heard from people was that science matters, that we're concerned about climate change, we want action, and we want to see an independent voice out there making sure the facts are getting to the Australian public, holding the government to account. So for the last 5.5 years, that's been our job. We spend a lot of time publishing reports that we hope are really well communicated to help the Australian public get across these very complex issues, from the science to the impacts to the solutions to policy areas, economics, etc. And so we've got two of our experts here today, but we've got a much bigger research team and expert team. So the work that we do, there is the science and research component, there is the communication component, which is sort of translation, if you like, of all of that complexity to the general public audience, and then it's distributing that, whether it's in the media or it's online. We engage a whole range of non-expert voices in that way as well. So we bring doctors, firefighters, solar installers, the voices of what this transition actually looks like, we bring them to the public too through our media work. That's most recently a group called the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action is something that we've been helping create through one of our councillors, Greg Mullins, who's a former fire chief from New South Wales. And that's 23 former emergency service and fire chiefs that can articulate these issues from their perspective, what it means to fight fires that are getting uncontrollable, very, very difficult to fight, what that means and what the transition needs to look like for them. So we do the research, we translate it, we get a whole range of people out there communicating to different audiences, and then we do a whole range of projects that are more tangible on the ground work. So we're currently in Port Augusta at the moment with a whole lot of local leaders from around Australia who are here to understand how Port Augusta has invested in renewable energy, what that's looked like for the community, what the transition away from coal, how has that been for the community, what has it been like, and then how do other places around Australia learn from the learnings here and take it back. So that's part of a program called the Cities Power Partnership, which is a partnership of over 100 local governments from around Australia. And as Jay said in his talk, when there's been an absence of federal government action, there's been a step up at the local level, at the state level. And we just hear this drumbeat from right around the country of people saying, we want to do something, we want to do more. And whether that's in electric vehicles, whether that's in a floating solar farm in Lismore, whether that's a bogey bulk buy in the Strathbogie Shire in Victoria, there's a huge amount of activity going on that's often masked in the media debate, which is just on the federal political scene. So I thought I'd give you that sort of update on who the Climate Council is and what we do, and then I'd take you on a journey to space. It doesn't necessarily have a logical flow there, but I'm asking you to come with me. So if we were to board a spaceship together where we are today and take off, who knows, maybe Elon Musk has created a solar-powered one, we'd be looking down as the Earth sort of falls away from us. We see Port Augusta start to look like little toys of buildings and cars and trucks. We'd see the Gulf opening up, the beautiful blue-green water and the desert beyond. Maybe we start to see the Australian Bight and then the continent of Australia. We probably can't tell that it's been one of the driest summers and autumns on record in southeastern Australia, but we could still see some fires burning in southeastern Australia at this time. As we keep going up and up, we go out past the atmosphere, and eventually we can turn around and have a look back at the Earth. And there it is, the little magnificent blue jewel hanging in space like an opal. This photograph is something that we wouldn't have been able to see before the I think it was the 1960s. This is a relatively new phase for humanity to even know what we look like in the vast expanse of space. This shimmering blue jewel, and it's potentially the only place where life exists in all of the black desert beyond. I think it's funny that when you see a movie about aliens, science fiction, and this imagined future where aliens arrive, they're here to steal our resources or to kill us all for some unknown reason. What they would come for is life. There's lots of rocks out in the universe. There's lots of water. There's a whole range of different things that you could be looking for. But life, we only know one place where that exists, and that's here where we all are. And looking from space, we can see, as Carl Sagan so eloquently put, all of those that we've ever loved and all of those that we've ever known. So when you see the Earth from this vantage point, it's kind of miraculous that each of us exists harbouring all of these amazing molecules and enzymes that don't exist anywhere else in the universe as far as we know. And it's very humbling to look from that perspective of space as to what this issue of climate change actually means. From a distance, it seems like we're squabbling over something that maybe seems nonsensical. What are the lines between countries? What is the squabbling of politicians, the vested interests that are looking for their interests today rather than the interests of all of us tomorrow? The coal-fired generators look very small. The renewable energy looks small too. From space, we just see one planet and a whole group of species that lives there on the only place in the universe. You can also see our atmosphere, this swirling array of gases that knows no borders. And if you've ever been in a greenhouse, you'll know how when you step through the doors of that glass house, it's suddenly much warmer. Well, similarly, the atmosphere acts as a greenhouse for us. If you were able to step from where we are in space now right to the surface of the Earth, you would notice a significant temperature change because of all of those gases swirling around, the most important being carbon dioxide, which of course is the core gas that we're talking about here at the moment. The simple science of climate change is if we burn more and more fossil fuels, we release more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. That fills up that atmosphere, that swirling atmosphere we can see from space. And the world gets hotter and hotter. So from the last 200 years, we've seen temperature accelerate. And from us looking from space, we're seeing this grand global experiment, the greatest that's ever been conducted, be conducted upon ourselves. Remember, there was this classic Clark and Dorr episode on the ABC where Clark is an oil executive, is asked about an oil spill, and he says, "Oh, well, I towed it outside the environment." But here in space, we see that there's only one environment. So Jay's given you some statistics about the challenge that South Australia has faced from climate change, whether it's the almost 50-degree day here in Port Augusta over the summer, or whether it's stone fruit cooking on trees over the last summer. We call the summer in Australia the angriest summer because it was so record-breaking right around the country. And those temperature records that were broken here, it was replicated in many, many parts of Australia. And it wasn't just temperature, of course, it was bushfire risk, and you might remember Townsville receiving a year's worth of rain in 10 days. So climate change is well and truly with us. Sorry. I realised I got caught up and didn't tell you about my slides. So there's the fruit grower, and there's the bushfires.
I can't see it.
Just move that closer to me. So there's Townsville in flood. So the solutions, and Jay has touched on this as well, but I thought I'd talk to it from my vantage point as well. I tend to group the solutions in two buckets. There's prevention, how can we stop the problem getting worse? And then there's coping. The problem is going to get worse to a greater or lesser degree. We need to make sure that we're prepared as best we can for what that future holds. We have all the technology necessary to transition by 2050 or earlier to net zero emissions. All sectors of society pollute in some ways, whether that's transport, energy, industrial emissions, agriculture, waste, etc. And there's lots of opportunities for change. And renewable energy is one of those opportunities, and it's the one that gets talked about the most. thought it was worth showing you this photo. This is, I was born 36 years ago, and these are the computers we were using 36 years ago. People were still saying in those days, you know, no one, there's varying quotes from computer scientists saying no one will use a laptop, it'll be too expensive. Of course, mobile phones, well, there weren't any. The phones that we were using looked like this. It's always worth kind of reminding ourselves to look back in time and say how much things change and how quickly they can change. So the technological revolution that's going on in Australia is well underway. The group from the Climate Council that's here today, we went to the Bungala solar farm today. We saw 420,000 panels shimmering in the sunlight. And Port Augusta has been on the front lines of the energy transition, with coal-fired generators closing down in this region in recent years, and a move towards more renewable energy. The fossil fuel infrastructure of the whole of the nation is ageing, it's inefficient, it's going to be shut down over time. And of course that means transition for workers. It means people will lose jobs, it means changes to communities. The better we plan, the more that we can plan and prepare at different levels of government, the better outcomes we'll have. And there's no denying that transition can be hard, and I think this town has experienced that transition directly. But what we saw today when we went to the Bungala solar farm was a great new opportunity on the ground. We talked to one of the workers there, Ben, who told us that he was a third generation coal-fired power station worker, and he was now working at the solar farm. So he's building the new energy industry of the future that potentially his children or grandchildren may well work in. There's no holding on to the coal-fired generation of the past. It's just not going to service us into the future. We need to create the new industries that will service workers and the community for the future. So, and tomorrow we're off to the big battery, which we're all very excited about. So I thought I'd finish with just a quick reflection. There's a lot of reasons to care about this issue, and I'll skip over that actually. There's a lot of reasons to care about this issue, and I mentioned the Earth as a whole, and some people say to me it's a strange thing to care about, but I think the idea of us being this one magnificent source of life in the universe is too amazing to let go of. We all need to come back to that, I think, as something that we're all part of that's magnificent and amazing. So it's a very big reason for me, but there's also a very small and growing reason, which is this little one, my 1-year-old. And I think about the world for her in 36 years, what the technology could look like. What is that phone from 36 years ago? What does it now look like into the future? What is the technology she'll use? And climate change will progressively get worse throughout her lifetime. There's no stopping that at this point. But how bad it gets will depend on what we do now. And she won't have the window in her life of being someone that can fight this. It's going to be too late by the time that certainly by the time she's 36. And by the time she has that agency. So ultimately it keeps coming back to us. So when I see her little face each day, it's a pretty huge motivator to keep going, and I know many people feel this when they look in the faces of their children or grandchildren. But we do sit at that juncture where the future is something that we can create from now. It's not something that's predetermined. So the last thing I wanted to say is, or two last things. One is, I like this quote about hope, and Jay mentioned hope as well, that hope isn't something stagnant. Hope is something that we create each and every day for ourselves. I like the idea that it's an axe that you break down the doors in an emergency, because we're certainly facing a crisis. And I'd end on just a quick story if I've got time.
Yes, sure.
So I took you out to space. Now I want to take you to Africa. And it's nighttime in Africa, all the animals are sleeping. And suddenly a storm comes across. There's lightning and thunder. One of the strikes of lightning hits a tree and it bursts into flame. That flame starts to engulf the bushes and trees around it, and quickly the forest is on fire. The animals all run away. They run to the top of the nearest hill, watching as the fire starts to engulf their homes. They're petrified. What will this mean for us? They're paralysed. Then the tiniest animal of all, the hummingbird, buzzes past all of them, taking a single drop of water to the fire. The hummingbird drops a droplet of water back to the river, back to the fire. The elephant, the largest animal of all, says to the hummingbird, "What do you think you're doing? You're not possibly going to make a difference." And the hummingbird just ignores him and keeps going. The monkeys are inspired. They get some banana leaves and throw water on the fire. The rhinoceros comes and starts stamping on the fire too. And eventually the elephant's ashamed and joins in too, putting it out with his trunk and maybe taking all of the credit. But the fire is out and the animals have worked together to get there. Not everyone wanted to do it in the start, but the hummingbird pushed and pushed and eventually everyone joined. I know that there are many hummingbirds in this room and it can be hard to keep going when the issue is scary and it is hard to keep looking at our politics sometimes and feel motivated. But that message of the hummingbird needs to be there with us all the time because we have come a long way and we still have a long way to go.
And sorry, I haven't heard before at the end as well. I really like it. I think it's inspiring. Well, I want to keep everybody to time, and I'm sure you all have great questions. So I'd like to invite up to the panel. We'll have Jay and Amanda, whom you've heard from. I'd love to ask for Brett and Sam to come up as well, if you wouldn't mind, and our climate experts, Leslie and Andrew. So if you wouldn't mind coming up, there's an extra chair there. I'm not sure if you'll need the mics, but they're there if you need them anyway. And I have a couple of questions to get us started with, and that's my prerogative because I have the loudest voice right now. So we have heard obviously from Jay and Amanda, and I'm sure you'll have questions for you, but I'd like to ask Sam, I'm going to point at you. Can you give us, for those of us who don't live in the community, maybe just a brief history of what your journey was getting renewables into Port Augusta to begin the ball rolling?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much. Do you want me to use the microphone or stand up? Or
Can you guys hear okay? Yeah, you can hear.
Everyone's all good? You want me to stand up or...?
Let's embarrass him. Stand up.
It's all the hard ones when you have a breath. I think he's good at it. Thank you all for coming first and foremost. It's lovely to see a nice crowd here this evening. The Renewable Journey started for myself in a very big way in Port Augusta on the 11th of June 2015. And to tell you a bit of the background of the story for those of you who don't know, and those of you from South Australia would know Mark Rasciuto and Chris Dittmar from Adelaide's Triple M radio station very well. I got woken up at 5:30am with a phone call from Mark Rasciuto, and he said, "Sam, we'd love to get you on air at 6 o'clock." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "Haven't you heard the news?" I said, "What news?" He said, "Oh, shit, you haven't heard." I said, "I'm sorry, mate, I honestly don't know what you're talking about." He said, "Haven't you read the paper?" I said, "Mate, the only thing I read this morning at 3 o'clock was literally Spock goes to the circus. Our first son, Hugh, was only 3 months old and not a great sleeper." So Mark says to me, "Go and get the newspaper and ring me back." I literally did. I walked out the front, rolled out the newspaper off the front, and I remember looking there, and it was cold and dreary and wet, and here I am in my boxer shorts and my slippers, looking at the paper thinking, oh shit. I had no idea that the closure was that imminent and imminent in 9 months. And what made that worse was only 3 months before that, the CEO of Alinta and the representatives from Alinta Energy, who obviously operated and owned the power station in Port Augusta, stood in the council chamber and gave their annual update to council and the community and said, "We're here to 2025. We've got a big enough coal resource to 2025. We all knew the power station was coming to an end. We all knew the end was coming, but we believed we had about 10 years to transition to something, not 9 months. It was a very sudden job. So that's when what was already in motion, and I say already in motion because my predecessor, Joy Baluka, who I give a lot of credit to, had already started this quest on the renewable journey. So the community was already aware of what solar thermal looked like, what renewable energy could look like, what it could be about, and then what life beyond coal could be very much for Port Augusta, because we knew that end was coming, but obviously we figured we had plenty of time to transition for it. What we then had to do was take what was likely to be a 10-year transition into about 9 months, and hope and pray like hell we could actually get some degree of an outcome. For me, my job was made relatively easy. All I had to do was stick to the script. If I was consistent on my messaging and consistent on the fact that I believed we would get a good outcome, and I believed we could transition to be the renewable capital, the benefit I had was of the community. And people like Repower Port Augusta, and if you haven't met some of the Repower crew, I know some of them are here, and I should unashamedly ask some of you to actually stand up or at least wave your hand in the air, because there are a few of you here, and there's a normal prerequisite work that you did. the community and those people and those volunteers actually stood up and started that question. Jay spoke about repower in a very positive way. They effectively took that question, made it move forward, and that added significant weight to the argument, because quite often you hear the bitter, whingy mayor, as some politicians like to label me at the time, but the fact that I had this independent community group and the power of community sitting right there made it very, very hard for some politicians to argue with, as I'm sure Joe would attest to. Certainly some members of his cabinet used to tell me that as well, that they wished it was just me walking in the door and not 14,000 people standing firmly behind me as well. It was a very powerful argument, but if I stuck to that script and worked with those people and we stuck to consistent messaging, we were able to achieve some of the significant outcomes that we've been able to achieve here in Port Augusta. To give you an idea of what actually happened during that period of time, we went from very little projects on the table, a few little solar projects in 2015, to last year when I left the mayoral office, we were looking at 13 real, and I say real, renewable energy projects, which was worth about $5.2 billion of capital investment, 4,500 construction jobs. So a significant boom over a short period of time. But it just goes to show that was the changing energy market. And I do have to give credit to Jay and his government, because it also made it easier for us when we weren't fighting with another tier of government, the state government, who are obviously very supportive, but also your policy and messaging is actually very confident. And the message you send to market is absolutely critical. And that's something I had to be mindful of. Every time I had a TV camera put in front of me, I had to be positive, I had to be consistent, I had to talk about becoming the renewable capital, even though there were days when I'd wake up and think, we're all staffed and we'll pack up and go home now. The worst thing I can do is stand in front of the camera and say, you know, we've just lost about 30% of our economy, we've just lost 190 jobs, it's a bit unfortunate, oh well, we'll just maybe go into tourism. We couldn't do that. We had to be consistent, we had to be strong. And fortunately, we did have that support of the state government at the time. We had good support from other members as well. Our local member, Dan Benholz-Pellicane, who's also here, and he was a strong advocate, and still is a strong advocate, obviously for his electorate, but also for new and emerging industries such as solar thermal as well. So that was the quest for us as we began. And obviously we capitalised very much on the state government's messaging, as Jay spoke quite a lot about, in terms of South Australia transitioning itself to a renewable economy. And I figured if I've got a premier out there saying I want to be a renewable economy, the reality is the state's going to transition to it. We might as well put our hand up and be the leaders and actually start to capitalise on it and get some reward for what we just lost with the closure of a coal-fired power station. Unfortunately, the federal government didn't agree, but that was life.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to jump in again, and we need microphones. Do you think it would be useful?
Yeah.
Okay, so people, grab your microphones. And I'd like to invite Brett to give us an overview of where he thinks Port Augusta might be heading now. Andrew, may
I think we can sit down if
you can sit down if you prefer.
can?
I think so. What do you think? We'll just inflict that on Sam.
I think the vision still continues for where we left when Sam was the mayor and we had the repower group. I think it's still possible. We've had a few setbacks. We did mention solar thermal, which is not followed through where they were going to go, but we still have, as Sam's mentioned, we did have 13. We've got 3 happening now. We still have another 8 waiting to occur. And the beauty of what is occurring is it's not one type of renewable energy. We are spread across 5 different types. And the government's only just underwritten the hydro projects, so they will occur. So we've got one of those on the cards here that should be kicking off soon. We've got the Coltana project, which is a bit longer away. But I think the vision of renewables here is still in the right direction. And I'm with Sam. We need to remain positive. We need to stay on track. What I want to do as a mayor is encourage our council to elaborate and spend more time with the companies that are coming to do this job and communicate with them regularly. Because I'll give you an example, solar thermal, I found that out from the news, which is disappointing because even when Sam was there, they used to meet with Sam, but my first 3 months I met with them regularly as well. I haven't spoken to them since. So we need to have that communication. And again, there was an announcement of the battery storage that was occurring immediately after. I did arrange a meeting with our Minister, who was great. He took it on board, and we had a discussion on how we can get this communication to happen between the company and the council and make sure that continues to go through. But I see nothing negative about the renewable possibilities in Port Augusta, but I think we need to be on the front foot. It's not all beer and skittles, as I say. There's hard work, and there's a lot of things that you need to focus on. A lot of these projects are on Section 49 land, which makes it difficult for a council. So those are the sort of things you need to look at with the infrastructure use, because to get to these projects and back, they use our infrastructure. So we need to be on the front foot with that and make sure. I always use the words of a royalty or some type of input from the business to make sure that if we're using a limestone sheeted road and you're building a multi-million-dollar facility, by the time you finish it should be bitumen. So the community can see the growth, not just in people building, because once these are built, there's not a lot of employment with the current ones. So yeah, I think we're setting in the right track. We just need to make sure we're on the front foot all the time.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll remind everybody that we do have our climate counsellors here as well, who are renewable and climate specialists and experts. So if you have questions for them as well, we definitely, I think we might move on to the audience questions. Does anybody have anything burning that, yes, there we go.
Bob Jumac, I'm an old ETSA employee. Just a background, it's not a loaded question. So I directed firstly to Jay, that's South Australian Power Networks. And I really can't remember who did what, so I'm not sort of trying to take it. If you knew then what you know now, have we gone the best way? And I've also got a family connection with solar installer. It seems that the difficulty of readjusting our whole grid setup, you know, when, as you said, it was very simple years ago. Now it's so much more complex. So things all go in different directions and so on. Do you think we went the best way by privatising it? Do we have enough control to make it all happen? Yeah.
Well, obviously, you know, from the Labor Party, we oppose the privatisation, so you expect me to say that. But I think the sort of bigger question is this: when the market was privatised, there was a lot of excess supply of energy around the whole of when they sort of created the national electricity market at about the same time. And there was a lot of extra generation. Governments tend to overbuild. Private sector tends to run things a little bit on the lean side. And really a couple of things happened that all really collided together at the same time. One is that the coal-fired power stations started to close, and because there wasn't a price on carbon, gas-fired generators, which you'd expect would be, because they're less carbon polluting, you'd expect that we'd want to encourage those, at least in a transitional sense. They were squeezed out of the market by the renewable energy. So you had this perverse outcome where you had renewable energy and coal, and gas found it very hard to operate, even though it's half as carbon polluting as coal. So and you got to this absurd situation, which was the cause of, you know, one of the crises that led to back in February 2017, where Pelican Point, the newest and most efficient gas-fired generator in the network, wasn't switched on because it was in mothballs, because it couldn't operate in this market, because the national government hadn't got themselves organised to put a price on carbon. If there had been a price on carbon, one that switched of sufficient size that meant that gas would get turned on more often or before coal, then it would have improved the viability of gas-fired generation. You would have had gas-fired plants available, and you would have had more competition in the system, would have put pressure on prices down, wouldn't have had any reliability issues. So you can imagine a different world if 10 years ago we had a price on carbon, and it would have solved a number of these problems. But that's not where we are. So it's that old story, you know, when you come up to somebody in a country road and you say, "How do I get into town?" They say, "Well, we can start from here." You know, that's sort of where we are at the moment. It's not a good place to start, but we are where we are. So look, I'm not sure I know how to unscramble the egg, you know, that you were talking about. We wouldn't have privatised it, but and you know, ironically, we've got back in the business of energy. You know, we sort of the gas-fired generator that we're talking about, using procurement. I mean, so what we really did was using modern means to get back in the business of energy generation. I really think that, you know, this is where we're probably heading. I think the market has been so abused by the lack of confidence that it's very hard to see private investors stepping up and actually filling the gaps. So I think it's going to be over to state governments, maybe the Commonwealth government in the future. This is the problem. I mean, in the past we had a market where you basically had private sector investment to invest in new generation.
I'll rephrase the question then.
Yeah.
With your answer, do you think there's now a role for government to step back in to get them fucking well organised?
Yes.
You mentioned those clever kiddies with their
Yes.
control system. I can visualise that.
Look, I think you're right. I actually think, even if you were to put a price, this is why I say that, gave that anecdote about, you know, we would start from here, because we were talking 10 years ago about putting a price on carbon. Now I think if you put a price on carbon, I don't think the market would believe it. Because, you know, you think of it, you're an investor, you've got this political battle between the two major parties. You've got to hope that for the next 30 years, one perspective is going to stay in place for long enough to get a return on your investment. It's a pretty big play. Whereas if you've got a government contract, see, that's why our solar thermal contract was quite valuable, because, you know, you weren't relying upon a market signal, you were basically relying upon a government contract. So that was an important part of the mix. So the short answer is yes. I actually think that the national electricity market is so broken now, I think that it's going to require increasing interventions. Now, obviously, what you want to try and do is intervene in a way which should preserve some species of the market. But that example I gave you before about those young people who've got this big technological solution to the whole market, that's typically a role for government. You couldn't really, it's not really a role for the private sector, because it sort of involves, you know, you've got to get everybody cooperating, you've got to compel everybody to cooperate. That's not typically what markets do. So, yeah, it's a long way of saying yes.
Indeed. Yes, we'll go here and then there, and if we can have the short answers too, that would be great, just to make sure that everybody does get a chance to ask their questions.
I'm happy for a long answer. But, my name's Anna. I'm a councillor on the Inner West Council in Sydney, so an urban council, highly densely populated, so quite different in terms of the choices and options we have, particularly in terms of investing in infrastructure on a large scale. So the options that we mostly have are investing in projects that are outside of our local government area. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is, I guess particularly from Jay's experience, but you all might have reflections on this, how do we at the local government level make that investment in an effective way, in a quick way, in a flexible way, in a way that helps the market move along, but that also manages and mitigates the risks in terms of our ratepayers in our community. I mean, we have legislative restrictions that really limit the risk that we can take. We have political, as everyone does, political restrictions. What are the sort of lessons that you can draw from your experiences about how, at a council level, we can manage those risks while we do our very best to push the market along?
Ooh, who wants to take that one?
Well, I'd just say if you're big enough or you collaborate with enough councils, your purchasing power might be sufficient to incentivise, you know, some new form of generation. And that's, I think that's what the ACT did. They managed to get up a wind farm actually here, isn't it?
Yeah, so,
But Andrew might be able to
yeah.
help.
Maybe I can make a couple of comments. I look after aspects of energy for the Climate Council as a councillor. And I've spent my life working in energy industries. So, a couple of thoughts. Let's take it back to South Australia for a moment. One of the things that the previous government, Weatherall government, did, at one of the points of the Rubicon was to, as one of its policies, bring out a policy to have smart solar storage in households, particularly focused around the underprivileged, so the housing trust households and underprivileged households combination of solar and smart battery systems for, I think it was initially 5,000 and then maybe grown to 20 or something, 40,000 households, to help mitigate exposure to high energy prices, and then to put it together with a smart battery system that could be collectively combined to act like a power plant. And one of the virtues, I think, of the current energy minister is he saw the sense in that and doubled down on it with the Liberal Party policy to continue to build on solar plus storage at the household level. Already South Australia has the highest penetration of solar panels in households in the nation, along with Queensland, and coupling that up with batteries means we'll have if all those households are successful in taking it up, we'll have a 500 megawatt power plant sitting in households across urban Adelaide, which when the going gets tough, those batteries will get going. That's the sort of thing, if you were to collaborate at a council level potentially, you may not, at the end of the day, if you had enough councils collaborating in the larger Sydney area, need to do that, because the state government may work out that it's in its interests to actually start to take some initiatives to help foster that sort of thing to happen. And I do think in New South Wales cases, it is in the state's interest, because I gave a talk today, just very quickly. New South Wales ran very close to the wind late last year in August. South Australia islanded, and we had a very close run in August where we islanded from the rest of the grid, and we could have had a statewide blackout again, but we didn't, because we've got a Tesla battery, and it stepped in and was one of the reasons it saved the day. Queensland was fine, but New South Wales and Victoria suffered blackouts and had to shut off the aluminium smelters. New South Wales now imports power just about every day from Victoria or Queensland. And so really, with this energy transition, it's important that communities in New South Wales recognise the risk that they're facing as communities and put pressure from the local level back through to the state level to take some initiatives like has happened in this state by both sides of politics to continue to foster that energy security.
Thank you, Andrew. We had a question. I don't think she's here. Anybody up right at the back?
Hi. Sorry. I'm a young person, as you can see. I'm very concerned about climate change. I have seen so far that a lot of the time people don't take action. It sort of takes you a while to take action because you haven't seen money in it. And it's starting to happen, and you can see in this area that that's definitely happening now. I wish I come from a country town in New South Wales originally, from a farm there. We don't have any of this infrastructure in place, nothing like this. I wish that we did. I'm just wondering, now that we can see money in it, I don't understand why both parties aren't working together, because it used to be, we should do good for the better of others versus we're going to take big bucks from different energy companies. Energy companies now are standing up and saying that they can see the investment. Obviously, they've been doing a lot of study into it. They know that they can make a lot of money if they go into renewables. Why aren't the two parties coming together now? And I suppose it's probably not an appropriate question to ask because we've got a Labor member here and I know that they're already acting on it. It's more the Liberal Party and the Nationals. But I just don't understand how that hasn't worked so far because we can see money in it. Why aren't both people coming on board, both parties coming on board?
I think we all want to know that.
Yeah.
Definitely. Leslie, is there something that... Sorry, Jay? Leslie, is there... No, you're happy to stand it?
Well, it's obviously a highly political question. I'll be kind to my Liberal colleague here. It's not all Liberals that don't believe in taking action on climate change. And but there are a substantial number of Liberals at a national level that do have that problem. And I think you also need to understand Queensland politics and how that affects national politics. There's a particular sort of issue in Queensland which is very much wrapped up in the coal industry, which plays into national politics. And the truth is we had a Prime Minister of this country, Malcolm Turnbull, who believed in taking action in climate change, and he was largely sort of hamstrung by a conservative element within the federal Liberal Party. So look, this election will be very important on this question, the upcoming federal election. It obviously looks like it's getting close. It's interesting that there are a number of Liberals at a national level who are calling themselves now modern Liberals and try and distinguish themselves from some of their Conservative colleagues and saying, well, I'm okay on climate change. So it'll be interesting to see how the Conservative Liberals fare in the election and how this all plays out. So I think we're at a watershed moment. Climate change is a very big issue in this election. So one of the parties has got it wrong. Somebody's going to be in for a big shock come the middle of May. Could be the Labor Party, could be the Liberal Party. But one way or another, this will be seen as a bit of a judgment about climate change, I suspect.
Also, just something,
Please.
something quickly. Look, I think none of us can answer the question really as to why climate change has become so ideologically split. But I think, as was alluded to earlier, when there is a vacuum or conflict at the federal level, what we are seeing in a very positive way is state and local government stepping up and the community stepping up. And I think what we've all got to do is simply avoid being paralysed by that ideological split and say, well, we all contribute to the problem, we've all got to get on and fix it. And as Amanda's story about the hummingbird illustrates, everybody can do something. And I think that the main thing we've got to do is avoid paralysis when we see our leaders behaving badly and behave better ourselves.
Brent, yeah?
Oh, thanks.
And then
Yeah, hi, look, perhaps to follow on to that question. My name's Brent Dwyer, I'm a councillor for the Greens in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, New South Wales. And it's just come up on my Twitter feed that Brian Fisher is trending. Now, for those who aren't aware, Brian Fisher has a long history of involvement in advising the former Howard government and has regularly rolled out as a spokesperson for the coal and oil industries, and has been wheeled out presumably by the incumbent government to dissemble and criticise the Labor Party's promises in the election to try and put some figures on the amount that Labor Party policies will cost. I just wonder whether anyone in the panel is familiar with his work. Tom Arup on Twitter, I should say, definitely is, and is well worth looking up for anyone who inhabits the Twitterverse. But I just wonder if anyone could comment on the just not just the content but the politics of introducing such a controversial commentator at this point in the election.
Well, let me not comment on politics because I'm not a political animal, but I have had debates with Brian Fisher for many years. In my previous life, one of the things I used to do was be the national president of what's now the Clean Energy Council. It used to be the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. And I clearly remember Brian Fisher running out arguments about how a 2% renewable target would bring doom and gloom and thousands of job losses, and the economy would tank if we went to 2% renewables. Well, I don't think the world's fallen in since we've gone to a higher renewable target. And I heard him in an interview this morning with Lee Sales, I think it might have been, or Frank Kelly, briefly, before I turned it off. Because it was so negative. And one of the things he said, to paraphrase, because I can't get it exactly, was the costs of climate change are large, but they're indeterminate and they're so far into the future that we can't estimate them. All we can do is estimate the costs of action now. And I thought to myself, well, that's not right, because we know now we are seeing more intense storms. For those people that are affected by more intense weather, it's costing them now. For people that can't insure their properties now, because they're now in areas that are uninsurable, it's costing them now. So no one that I'm aware of in the Twitterverse, and I'm not on Twitter, has yet come out with those sorts of costs. But I'm sure if you were to talk to people in the Insurance Council of Australia, they would say, yes, it's costing us now. I'm sure, as we've heard, Greg Mullins and 22 other firefighter chiefs would say it's costing us now in fighting bushfires. And we're no longer likely to be able to mobilise firefighting aircraft from the Northern Hemisphere into the Southern Hemisphere summers because they're going to need them in the Northern Hemisphere winters fighting fires. So things are changing now, and I personally find it disgraceful that a so-called expert economist can run arguments out like that. And I think at the guts of it all, the average punter isn't fooled by that anymore.
Yeah.
Because the average person sees it's affecting them now.
I just add to that, I'm sorry, I've never heard of Brian Fisher, but I'm not an economist. But I think the Climate Council will send him a report next week to give a pre-ad where we're putting out a report next week on the cost of climate change, which was contributed to, presumably not by Brian Fisher, but by many other expert economists, so we'll send him a copy.
Can I just comment on, one of the first things you're taught in economics is that when you're making an assessment of the decision, economics is an evaluation of both the costs and the benefits. That's the nature of the decision is an evaluation of the costs as against the benefits to try and make an optimal decision. That's really what economics is all about. And it's difficult to understand how somebody who calls themselves economists would simply focus on just one side of the equation, unless you're going to assume that the people advancing action on climate change are not doing it for some benefit. And just going back to that earlier point about why this has become politicised, that the young lady's question before, in some countries it isn't. So in some countries, like the United Kingdom, where Margaret Thatcher, who was a trained scientist, as a conservative, probably one of the most conservative leaders in Britain, took action on climate change. And one of the parts of her analysis was, because the science was probably less certain back in the 1970s when she was making those decisions, was that it was a risk mitigation strategy. So the benefit is you're taking action in case all of these scientists are correct. And sure, it's a long-term future risk, some evidence of which we're beginning to see now, but it's a risk of complete catastrophe. And that's what we insure every day. We don't expect our houses to burn down, but we pay quite large amounts of money each year on the basis that there's a possibility it might burn down. So clearly there's a benefit. And that needed to be weighed against the cost. Yet he made no attempt to do that, and that's just completely antithetical to the profession of economics.
Thank you. Great. I had one over here first, and then we'll be over here. I think I've been ignoring this side of the room. I'm so sorry. I think you're out of my periphery a little bit.
Carol Bailey. I'm a councillor from Mount Barker Council in the Adelaide Hills, the eastern side. I was interested to hear recently that a very small company, Adelaide company, I think Cool and Cozy is its name, has won a contract to put solar panels on about 300 roofs in Whyalla. And this interested me because I know the company and they work in the Adelaide Hills now and again. They can only do it because they got that number, because they put it at a special price. And I'm wondering whether this is the way to go, whether we should incentivise and create possibilities for these groups like 200, 300, 400 at a special price, so that the company can make that discount by volume of number. Is that the way to go?
I'll answer that one actually, as Director of the Cities Power Partnership, which is our local government arm, and the short answer that I've asked everybody to give is absolutely. So we do have some examples of councils that we work with that do things like that. The most famous one I think would be the Strathbogie bulk buy. So what Strathbogie did, which for those of you who don't know, is a very regional rural council in Victoria, had a lot of energy poverty with their elderly citizens who were afraid to turn on their heaters and their air conditioners because they just couldn't cover the electricity bills. So what Strathbogie did was use a rate system where they used the rates from their as they could, for groups to be able to do a bulk buy for their citizens and then recouped that through their rates. So with just a little addition on with that. So that enabled those organisations to do discounted bulk buys for their people, and they got such a massive take-up of that they were able to install a free system on their local bowls club, which was just lovely for them as well, and a really feel-good thing. But what they also did, which is really important, is they hired for 1 year a consultant to be on call for those people, to be able to answer and understand what was actually happening. If they had any problems with their system, they had somebody they could call they knew would be responsive. And it's been such a massive success that we have 13 other councils around the country now replicating that. So absolutely, there are ways around it. There are other examples as well. But simply just doing it in that way, where council paid for it up front and then recouped using rates, was a really, really successful model. Pleasure. I think, yes, please.
My name is Gary Canine, I'm a local resident. I've got some questions about the potential Adani mine. It seems that federal Labor's trying very hard not to aggravate people in Queensland and in Victoria, so that they're sort of sitting on the fence. My understanding is that Australia's total emissions are less than the increase in annual global emissions. I don't know if that's correct, but that's what I've read. If that's about right, it means, the question I have then is, some people suggest that selling Australian coal would be better in the long term because our coal is cleaner and less polluting than coal from Brazil or Indonesia, for example. Can you talk to that? I mean, is there a logic to that argument? And I hope there's not, because it's scary to think that we have that globally we may be better off selling our coal, opening up a new mining area, so that China and everywhere else who has everyone else who wants to burn coal doesn't burn more polluting coal from other parts of the world, which then puts us up the creek even further, so to speak.
Anybody?
Okay, well, a couple of comments. Firstly, I'm not an expert on Adani. Your comment about where Australia stands, I think Australia ranks about 12th in terms of global emissions for just the country itself, but if you add in the emissions from all of the LNG and coal that we export, we rank about 5th in the world. So what we do and export makes a difference. It's a bit of a funny game in the way people count emissions, because no one counts or accredits the emissions that we all attribute or don't attribute to the products we buy from China. I mean, think about how much the West now buys from China. China gets saddled with those emissions as a country from making all those products that we all buy, and we get the credit because we're now buying stuff that's manufactured somewhere else. So it's a bit of a game. Coming back to emissions and Adani, Adani is a critical mine because it is the foundation mine for opening up the Galilee Basin. Some people say, how on earth can Clive Palmer be spending so much money on political advertising, and why is he doing it? A, he can't afford to pay workers that he's put out of a job in Townsville, and notwithstanding the difficulties here in Port Augusta, people at least got to pay their dues when they left the power station, I believe. Clive wouldn't do that for his workers, and yet he's, in my view, got the gall to spend a hell of a lot of money on our advertising on our TVs. Why is he doing that? Well, it just so happens that Clive Palmer's got a mining permit substantially greater than Adani's, sitting right next to it in the Galilee Basin. So join the dots. So Galilee is a foundation project. Adani is in the hole and sunk a lot of money, probably upwards of $1 billion, into trying to get that, A, in terms of what it paid to buy it in the first place, and B, trying to develop it and then get throughput out through Apple Point, which is a coal loader that it also owns. If it can't ultimately get this project up, it's going to have to take a big write-down on its books. I guess it doesn't want to do that either. So it's a bit of a life or death struggle for Adani, I think, corporately. It's a life or death struggle for the environment in Queensland. And unfortunately, people are suckered by the jobs. And the reality is, and I think you see that here, and this is not, the projects here are big, but they're not that big, and yet they've created a lot of jobs. And I think they've changed the nature of the feeling in the community. I mean, I've just chatted to a few people, and I get the sense that people in Port Augusta are proud of this community now. They're proud to be a leader in renewables. I just don't think that Adani's going to deliver that for Queenslanders.
The gist of my question really is selling Australian coal of a higher quality a better, worse option than using...
So coming back to burning coal, look, the hard reality of it is we can't afford to keep burning coal. There's a thing called a carbon budget, and if we keep putting more of the stuff in the air, it doesn't matter whether it's clean or dirty. And don't believe the arguments about clean coal power stations and ultra-crude, supercritical and all the rest of them, because at the end of the day it's still a single use and it goes up the stack into the air. So it doesn't matter whether it's clean or dirty coal, it's producing CO2. That's the core of the problem, and we've got to deal with the problem at its root core.
We're starting to run out of time a little bit.
Add something briefly to that
Sure.
question. The differences between the cleanness of coal are quite marginal. The other point is that the scale of Adani, if it went ahead, well, they've cut back the scale a bit. If it went ahead with what they were proposing, the impact it would have on world prices would put Hunter Valley coal producers out of business, and their coal is, in inverted commas, cleaner than Adani. Third thing is, my understanding of the deposits in the Galilee Basin is that they get progressively worse, and Clyde Palmer's a particularly poor quality coal. So, in fact, if you open it up and then plug more coal out of the Galilee Basin, you'd actually be getting more, inverted commas, dirty coal. So, but at the end of the day, the point is it's all marginal compared to what you need to do in the global carbon market.
To second that, it's actually, you guys published a fact sheet 2 years ago on Adani, and it's double the Australian benchmark, so we can't actually burn it here. We can only send it offshore because it is that dirty. So it's double the Australian benchmark for what would be considered acceptable burnable coal for Australia. So it's actually we're sending much dirtier coal than sex from the Galilee Basin.
But we're all one opal.
That's it, we're in one gleaming jewel, aren't we? I know that we still do have questions. We are fairly much out of time, and I do hate cutting everybody off. So you have? We have come a long way.
Ask the lady.
Yes, sure, go ahead, please.
I want to ask about solar thermal and whether there's still a position for it in the current mix of energy, because it's such a big upfront investment, as opposed to batteries that you can add on to and solar farms that you can add on to and wind farms you can add on to. Is there still a position for something big or not?
And can I add to that and ask, can we use superannuation money to fund it?
Ooh, double barrel questions. That's sneaky. That's getting more than the last question in, isn't it?
Make some technical comments. I mean, you're right. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the person to probably ask that question of is Dan, because he's probably better informed on that than anyone else in the audience. And I don't know whether you'd care to comment, Dan, without. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I have. But
I'm happy to. I don't want to interfere.
No, please, this is fair.
You want to maybe make a couple of comments about the status of the project?
Right.
It's desperate to ask a question. Just on that, no, it's not dead. The very, very unfortunate reality is that the company that entered into a contract with the previous state government is unable to deliver on the contract for a range of reasons. It's a private company. It's not a publicly listed company, so a lot of the information about solar reserve is not something that I should talk about. It's not publicly available. The reality is, though, that company can't deliver. And just as a very quick tangent to add to some things that have been said here, apologies, it is often easy to concentrate on the negatives or the differences. And while Jay and I shared 8.5 years, I think it was, Jay, in Parliament, we overlapped, the focus is on the things we disagreed on. The reality is there'll be more things that we do agree on most of these things. You'll also find that Liberal and Labor state governments across the nation are actually not that far apart either, whereas Labor and Liberal federal governments haven't really, in my mind, got their act together. So put that in context. I supported wholeheartedly, in fact I urged Jay to enter into that contract. When it happened, wholeheartedly supported it, as certainly local people from Port Augusta would know. So back to the heart of it. Is it dead? No. Solar Reserve wants to sell their assets. They want to sell potentially their IP, potentially their land access agreements, potentially a whole range of other things, including state government planning approval. Can they do that? I'm not overly optimistic, to be really straight. Is it possible? Yes. Will they? I'm not wildly optimistic, but do I want them to have the chance to do it? Absolutely. And then could a third party bid back in? Yes, of course. What I'd add to that, though, and I don't want to go too long, I'm sorry, and I think, Andrew, or perhaps this lady whose name I don't know, I apologise, who were introduced as the experts.
Leslie.
Nothing's gone backwards about solar thermal in the last few years. But other technologies, at least from an economical perspective, have moved forward. And I'll give you another parallel example. Most big solar farms at the moment are not using tracking techniques to follow the sun, because while years ago that was really the most cost effective, the cost of solar panels has gone down so much further. The cost of tracking hasn't. So most solar farms invest in more land, more panels, and just face them in one direction because that's more cost advantage. So again, back on track, solar thermal, nothing's gone backwards with solar thermal. But other technologies, the cost has come down and down.
Is it costing too much now for
Well,
the big thing?
but that's a relative thing, isn't it? It probably doesn't cost any more than it was ever going to, but other things have come down. And the last thing I would say on this is we all want clean, renewable energy with storage so that it can become reliable. I'm sure everybody in the room agrees with that. If Repower Port Augusta had started with a vision of pumped hydro or something else, I'm sure we would have all been pretty comfortable going that way too. It turned out to be solar thermal because that's what was the most attractive, and it still is incredibly attractive. And it was beyond zero emissions. And Doctors for the Environment that actually came to Port Augusta and put this to us, and then support swelled from there. Speak for myself, I'm terribly disappointed that we might not have solar thermal. But if it turned out to be pumped hydro, or it turned out to be another storable, clean energy, that would be okay with me too. So,
Please, thank you. For exclusively renewable energy, Dan.
Sorry, Lisa?
The tender that has gone out now.
No tender has gone out.
No, the call for the expressions of interest
And
for power supply is not your government has not requested that it's exclusively renewables. So there is a high chance it could end up being gas. So you haven't closed the door on fossil fuels, you have left it open.
Happy to participate if that's what you want. No, Lisa, and neither did the previous governments. The previous government's tender was not for 100% renewable either, but it landed with solar thermal. Ours is not for 100% renewable either. You're quite right, but I don't think that's a criticism.
But you just said, why didn't you close the door on gas?
Oh, sorry.
Why not close the door on gas if we want zero emissions?
Because we're looking at all of the options. No, we're looking at all of the options.
Because it's not about climate, it's about money.
Oh, well, Lisa.
Maybe I'll step
happy
in
to
and say,
chat with you anytime.
Look, I mean, I think it's good that governments run tenders. I'd encourage the current government to think about the emissions that might come from, as part of the consideration of the solutions, that they think about not just price but emissions. And not just the price today, because one of the things you can be sure about with gas in Australia now is it's going to stay expensive. It's now inextricably linked to the world oil price and the Australian dollar. And versus the US dollar. So one thing you know about oil price is a bit like electricity price. You don't know what it's going to be tomorrow, but it's probably unlikely to go down too often and more likely to go up. So gas will be expensive. Doesn't mean that you won't get gas in the tender, I'm sure. But I think what we hear in all the communities we talk to is that people at the community level want to deal with solving the problem for the long term and getting emissions out of the solutions that governments buy. And so a very elegant solution that would really suit this part of the woods in South Australia clearly, and I don't think gas would, because there's a run pipeline to get here, would be to advance more renewables, whether it's wind or solar or a combination of both, and I mean solar PV, together with the pumped hydro, whether it's Coltana or I think there's another one.
Goat Hill.
Goat
That's
Hill.
right. Yep.
So put those three things together, encourage those complementary technologies, and you can forget about gas price risk forever in terms of the power, and you can forget about carbon emissions from that forever too.
Can I ask about the interconnector then? How does that sort of factor into it?
Well, I actually think, I'm in two minds.
No, that's right. And I'm sorry, after this one, we are
But
so out of time.
Just to comment very briefly, I actually think the interconnector with New South Wales, as I understand it's being contemplated now, where it will also open up new renewable energy zones along its route. So in northeastern South Australia, where it traverses through the River Murray, southwestern New South Wales and northeastern Victoria, is a good thing. There are increasing days, and we've seen some just in the last few days in South Australia, where the market operator, AEMO, is turning renewables back and turning gas back too, but it's doing that because we've got too much. And we want to continue to build out our competitive advantage. My belief, I live in Adelaide, let's build out our competitive advantage in this state. We've got great resources. We've got a can-do attitude among our people. We don't have IR issues in delivering projects like sometimes exist in other places. We can deliver on time, on budget, so let's back ourselves, deliver this stuff. And I said earlier in the meeting that, or sometime today, that New South Wales has got a few issues, almost always is importing power from Victoria or Queensland. Well, let them import clean power from South Australia, that's my view. So let's double down on renewables, firm it up and sell it into New South Wales and give them back a bit of what they've been chewing us out a bit over the years when we had some tough times.
Yeah, let's leave it with that. And my apologies to everybody. Oh, and I know you drove a long way and you are the very first person here.
I'd like to leave it on a positive comment. I can remember in the 80s we all had a discussion about CSCs.
Yep.
Nah, the air conditioning's gone, won't have a refrigerator, but we managed it.
Yep.
So I see climate change is no different. We've been there before, we managed it, governments got together and we did the job. So I see no different in climate change now.
Great. Yeah, agreed. Thank you everybody so much for tonight. For engagement. Our apologies to those questions we didn't get to. There's always going to be, especially because I know you were jumping up and down a lot. I'm very sorry. And thank you all very much for coming. And if you would just join me in thanking our panel for their time.